Amigos de Noticias de hoy, tengan muy buenas tardes. Hoy tenemos un video ahorita interesante para ustedes. Es la primera entrevista que le hicieron al vicepresidente de Estados Unidos, a JD Vance, en Face the Nation. Así que vamos a echarle un vistazo a eso. Parece ser bastante buena la entrevista, según han dicho, o según fue su recepción.
It was a tie, bipartisan opposition.
Los subtítulos están bien, así que eso ayuda a los que necesitan subtítulos y pues vamos a darle.
Smallest margin since the job was created, you had to break that tie. If the nominee can't unite your party, how's he going to lead 3 million people?
Well, look, I think Pete is a disruptor, and a lot of people don't like
Ok, está hablando sobre Pete Hegseth,
that
pero si tienen
disruption.
dudas.
But Margaret, that disruption is incredibly necessary. If you think about all of those bipartisan massive votes, we have to ask ourselves, what did they get us? They got us a country where we fought many wars over the last 40 years, but haven't won a war about as long as I've been alive. They've got us a military with a major recruitment crisis, a procurement price crisis that's totally dysfunctional, where we buy airplanes for billions and billions of dollars, terrible cost overruns, the delivery dates are always delayed. So we need a big change. Now, admittedly, there are people who don't like that big change, but it is necessary, and it's explicitly what Donald J. Trump ran on, and I think part of the reason why the American people elected him their 47th president.
So the main
Algo que no se puede negar de JD Vance, y para mí es algo espectacular en él. Antes que digan que soy Trump supporter, Vance supporter, lo que sea, no lo soy. Es más, yo creía que Donald Trump tenía todas las de ganar después del debate con Biden. Dije, ok, Trump ganó. Después del intento de asesinato, Trump ganó, nadie lo frena. Y eligió a Vance como vice. Yo dije, eso no fue bueno, porque agarró a alguien que no va a traer a nada nuevo, va a traer a alguien que va a traer las mismas personas a las que le atrae Trump. O sea, al mismo tipo de votante que apoya a Trump iba a traer Vance. No eligió a alguien que podría haber traído apoyo de voto latino, voto negro, lo que sea. Eligió a alguien que es como él. Y eso me pareció una mala jugada. Y después del debate de Trump con Kamala, le di más chance a Kamala, la verdad. Pero algo que no puedo negar es que Vance, cuando le dan una pregunta, el hombre la responde. No es de dar demasiadas vueltas. Trump esquiva preguntas de forma impresionante. Le preguntan sobre A, te habla sobre B. Vance es muy bueno respondiendo preguntas. Eso se lo tengo que reconocer.
objective is changing all of that it's going to be Pete Hegseth alone?
I'd say the main problem the main thing that we want Pete Hegseth to do is to fix the problems at the Department of Defense. And unfortunately, there are many. We've gotten into way too many wars that we don't have a plan for winning. We've gotten into way too many misadventures that we shouldn't have got into in the very first place. And our procurement process, Margaret, is incredibly broken. We're in an era.
Decisions.
Well, of course, they're policy decisions, but they're also logistical and implementation decisions. If you look at where we are with the rise of artificial intelligence, with the rise of drone technology and drone warfare, we have to really, top to bottom, change the way that we fund the procurement of weapons, the way that we arm our troops. This is a major period of disruption, and we think Pete Hegseth is the guy to lead the job. Now, there's another element to this, Margaret, too, which is we believe that military morale, at least until the election of President Trump, was historically low. You had the Army missing recruitment goals by tens of thousands of soldiers, and already recruitment is starting to pick up because Pete Hegseth is fundamentally a warfighter's leader at the Department of Defense. He is a guy who sees not through the perspective of the generals or the bureaucrats, he looks at things through the perspective of the men and women that we send off to fight in our wars.
Both the Wall Street Journal and the National Review, conservative publications, as you know, have been critical of Tulsi Gabbard. The Review called her an atrocious nominee who deserves to be defeated. They compared her defense of Edward Snowden, the fugitive who stole U.S. secrets, to an attorney general who thinks the mob gets a bad rap. Her refusal to accept U.S. intelligence findings that Assad gassed his own people, they said, was like a nominee for OMB director not being able to count. Does any of this give you pause putting her in charge of the U.S. intelligence community? Yes or no?
No, Margaret, look, these are publications that attacked Donald J. Trump obsessively, but those publications don't determine who the president is, the
and
American people
supported
do.
Him.
And Donald J. Trump is the person who determines who his cabinet is, not these publications that I think, frankly, have lost relevance.
The Senate will
Tulsi
ultimately
Gabbard's,
decide.
Well, the Senate will.
No solo esas publicaciones perdieron relevancia, sino prácticamente todos los medios principales, medios tradicionales han perdido relevancia por, no quiero atribuirme el mérito a nada de esto, ¿no? Pero por Internet en general. Ahora la principal fuente para consumir contenidos de noticias y todo esto, hace mucho dejó de ser la televisión. Aún tiene su fuerza, es obvio, pero Internet es el carro ganador en el momento. La mayoría de la gente se informa a través de Internet.
Provide advice and consent as is its constitutional obligation, but I feel confident that Tulsi Gabbard will ultimately get through. Two things that are important to know about Tulsi. First of all, she is a career military servant who's had a classification at the highest levels for nearly 2 decades. She has impeccable character, impeccable record of service, and she also is a person who I think is going to bring some trust back to the intelligence services. The bureaucrats at our intelligence services have gotten completely out of control. They've been part of the weaponization of our political system, the weaponization of our justice system. We need to have good intelligence services who keep us safe, but part of that is restoring trust in those services, and we think Tulsi is the right person to do it. That's
she
why the
doesn't trust
president.
those intelligence services.
She recognizes that the bureaucrats have gotten out of control, and we need somebody there who's going to rein them in and return those services to their core mission of identifying information that's going to keep us safe.
You campaigned on lowering prices for consumers. We've seen all of these executive orders. Which one lowers prices?
We have done a lot, and there have been a number of executive orders that have caused already jobs to start coming back into our country, which is a core part of lowering prices. More capital investment, more job creation in our economy is one of the things that's going to drive down prices for all consumers, but also raise wages so that people can afford to buy the things that they need. If you look
Tengo que reconocer que fue una excelente respuesta. Lo fue. O sea, no puede citar de memoria y cabeza todas las órdenes ejecutivas que ha firmado Donald Trump, pero, hey, en una semana Donald Trump ha hecho trabajo impresionante. No estoy de acuerdo con todo lo que ha hecho, obviamente, pero en relación cantidad, ha hecho mucho. ¿Cuándo vieron Saben que defendí mucho a Biden. Lo saben. Para mí hizo bastante cosas bien. No me gustó para nada el final de su presidencia, solo los perdones, que él dijo que no iba a dar y no iba a dar y que al final lo dio a su hijo, lo dio a medio mundo. No estoy del todo de acuerdo con eso, creo que quemó completamente su reputación, pero comparen tal vez uno de los días, la semana más atareada de Joe Biden con esta primera semana de Trump. Trump hizo más en una semana que Joe Biden en, no voy a decir toda su presidencia porque eso sería algo absurdo, pero Trump hizo más en una semana que Biden en tal vez algunos meses. Eso es innegable.
Look at our slate of executive orders. No, Margaret, prices are going to come down, but it's going to take a little bit of time, right?
Es un proceso.
The president has been president for all of 5 days. I think that in those 5 days, he's accomplished more than Joe Biden did in 4 years. It's been an incredible breakneck.
Es prácticamente lo que dije, pero exagerando un poco. No hizo más que Biden en 4 años, pero hizo más que Biden en algunos meses.
Pace of activity. We're going to work with Congress. We're, of course, going to have more executive orders, and we're going to try the way that you lower prices is that you encourage more capital investment into our country. And you ask specifically, what executive order is going to help lower prices? All of the stuff that we've done on energy, to explore more energy reserves, to develop more energy resources in the United States of America. One of the main drivers of increased prices under the Biden administration is that we had a massive increase in energy prices. Donald Trump has already taken multiple executive actions that are going to lower energy prices, and I do believe that means consumers are going to see lower prices at the pump and at the grocery store, but it's going to take a little bit of time. Rome wasn't built in a day, and while we've done a whole lot, we can't undo all of the damage.
Claro, creo que es absurdo cobrarle resultado a todo con que 6, 7 días de presidencia. Hay que ser un poco sensatos también, ¿no?
Of Joe Biden's presidency
well, there are a
in
lot
4
of things
days.
That contributed to higher energy prices, and there was record oil and gas production.
Yes, Joe Biden did many terrible things to lead to an
see,
increase in prices. I agree, Margaret.
No, but all the things you experience at the grocery store are what people touch and feel. That's what you were talking about, bacon on the campaign trail.
Of course, of course.
Those things when do consumers actually get to touch and feel a difference in their lives?
Well, Margaret, how does bacon get to the grocery store? It comes on trucks that are fueled by diesel fuel. If the diesel's way too expensive, the bacon's going to become more expensive. How do we grow the bacon? Our farmers need energy to produce it. So if we lower energy prices, we are going to see lower prices for consumers, and that is what we're trying to fight for.
Well, the flurry of executive orders, most of them weren't about the economy. Many of them
were, though, Margaret. We had, I think we've taken.
No sé si lo notan, pero eso es algo que yo sí lo noto, y es que se nota cuando una periodista tiene una agenda, está intentando impulsar algo, empujar una narrativa, forzar algo. Y esto creo que es algo que a ustedes les ha cansado, o a cualquier espectador de noticias en general, porque cansa cuando ves que intentan forzar una situación cuando, hey, no hace falta ser tan así, ¿no? Está queriendo chocar con él de una forma u otra y él está esquivando con una habilidad impresionante que yo no sabía que él tendría. Lo está intentando hacer quedar mal y todo eso, pero él lo está esquivando con mucha gracia. Vance lo está haciendo muy bien, muy bien.
promise of tariffs by February 1st.
We've taken over 200 executive actions, some executive orders, other executive actions. Again, this is in less than a week, and a lot of them were focused on the economy, bringing investment into our country and lowering energy prices. We've also focused on safety, restoring public safety, ending weaponization of the Department of Justice. We've done a lot. And I think the president is to be commended for actually coming in and doing something with this incredible mandate the American people gave him. He's not sitting in the Oval Office doing nothing. He's doing the American people's business, and I think they're going to see a lot of good effects from it.
Well, a lot of these announcements have yet to take effect.
Sure.
The president did say he wants to do something with an executive order in relation to federal emergency response. He said he may reform or eliminate FEMA. Instead of sending emergency responders, he may start to send a percentage of money to states to take care of themselves. But you know, FEMA has specialized expertise that some of these states just don't have in their arsenal. And
I wish
how
that they...
will states who are lower income states, the Mississippis, the Kentuckys, the Alabamas, be able to do this for themselves without federal help?
Well, the president, to be clear, is not saying we're going to leave anybody behind. He's saying that in the way that we administer these resources, some of which is coming from the federal level.
Exactamente. La reportera acaba de decir como si hubieran dicho, ok, acá tienen su parte del dinero, cuídense, se las arregla, si tienen un problema, nosotros no nos vamos a meter. No es eso lo que está diciendo. La tipa estaba desinformando. Perdón por la palabra, la tipa.
Some of which is coming from the state level. We've got to get the bureaucrats out of the way and get the aid to the people who need it most.
But these
Let's
are the
be
first
honest,
responders.
Margaret, you talk about the expertise from FEMA. FEMA in North Carolina, in California, in Florida with some of the hurricanes has often been a disaster. And it's not because we don't have good people at FEMA, it's because bureaucratic red tape and garbage prevents the rapid deployment of resources to the people who need it most.
But the states are now going to have to do this themselves?
The president is trying to encourage us to reform the way that we deliver emergency response in a way that gets resources to the people who need it.
So don't take him literally, is what you're saying.
We should take the president at his word that FEMA needs desperate reform, because it does. Margaret, when I went to North Carolina as VP-elect, but before we were sworn in, people would talk about how FEMA would get resources, food, medicine, water, to a warehouse, but then would have no plan to get it from the warehouse to the people in the mountains who were literally starving and thirsting to death. We can do so much better, and under Donald Trump's leadership, we will.
But they work with the state and local officials.
They often don't work well enough. And again, that's not because of
the state and local officials?
No, the FEMA management officials don't work well enough with the state and local officials to get resources to the people who need it. We should expect, and this is, I think, one of the fundamental premises of President Trump's leadership, the American people should expect more of their government. When there's a terrible disaster, they should expect food, medicine, and water to get to the people who need it. When there's a terrible fire in California, the fire hydrants ought to actually turn on. I am sick of the American people having such low expectations for their government. They should demand more of us, because this is the greatest country in the world, and that's what...
Acaba de decir, y tiene toda la razón, es indignante las necesidades que llegan a tener las personas acá en Estados Unidos, siendo que, hey, ¿acaso no es la mayor economía del mundo? El primero de los primeros mundos, el más poderoso, el más moderno, el más rico. Es impresionante las calamidades que pasan y el desempeño para resolver las cosas es pésimo. Tiene toda la razón.
What Donald Trump's leadership promises to bring back.
So still count on the federal government, but watch that space. Let me ask you about another area that you campaigned on quite a lot, and there was a flurry of activity on, and that has to do with immigration.
Sure.
The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops this week condemned some of the executive orders signed by President Trump, specifically those allowing immigration and customs enforcement to enter churches and to enter schools. Do you personally support the idea of conducting a raid or enforcement action in a church service, at a school?
Well, let me address this. Of course, if you have a person who is convicted of a violent crime, whether they're an illegal immigrant or a non-illegal immigrant, you have to go and get that person to protect the public safety. That's not unique to immigration. But let me just address this particular issue, Margaret, because
Qué excelente respuesta. Sabes que una persona muy mala que ha cometido muchos crímenes está ya sea en una iglesia, en una escuela, donde sea. Tienes información que esa persona está ahí, ya sea inmigrante o no. No vas a hacer nada solo porque, oh, es una escuela, es una iglesia. El peligro que esa persona representa, dependiendo de quién sea la persona y los cargos que tenga y lo que sea su historial, representan un peligro muchísimo mayor. La inacción, la inactividad, es un peligro mucho mayor. Excelente respuesta, JD Vance.
as a practicing Catholic, I was actually heartbroken by that statement. And I think that the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops needs to actually look in the mirror a little bit and recognize that when they receive over $100 million to help resettle illegal immigrants, are they worried about humanitarian concerns or are they actually worried about their bottom line? We're going to enforce immigration law. We're going to protect the American people.
Yeah.
Donald Trump promised to do that. And I believe the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, if they're worried about the humanitarian costs of immigration enforcement, let them talk about the children who have been sex trafficked because of the wide open border of Joe Biden.
You personally
let them talk
support them
about
going into
people like
schools
Laken
and
Riley
churches.
who were brutally murdered. I support us doing law enforcement against violent criminals, whether they're illegal immigrants or anybody else, in a way that keeps us safe. Let me ask this question,
But
Margaret.
¿Cómo alguien puede estar en contra de esa declaración? ¿Cómo? Creo que es imposible, ¿verdad? Creo que si tienes sentido común, es imposible que estés en contra de esa declaración.
Let's separate the immigration issue. If you had a violent murderer in a school, of course I want law enforcement to go and
course.
get that person out.
Of
So what's
course.
the point of the question?
You changed the regulation this week. That's the point of the question.
Exactly.
Giving the authority
Yes.
to go into churches and go
Exactly.
into schools.
We empowered law enforcement to enforce
But
the
that
law
also
everywhere
has
to
a
protect
knock-on
Americans.
effect, a chilling effect, arguably, to people to not send their
I-
kids to school.
I desperately hope it has a chilling
In the
effect on
churches,
illegal
you think
immigrants
the
coming
U.S.
into our
Conference
country.
of Catholic Bishops are actively hiding criminals from
I think the U.S.
law
No diré nada.
Conference of Catholic Bishops has frankly not been a good partner in common sense immigration enforcement that the American people voted for. And I hope, again, as a devout Catholic, that they'll do better.
There are 5 legal challenges already to one of the other immigration actions, the order on birthright citizenship. A federal judge appointed by Ronald Reagan, I think you'd agree, has some conservative credentials,
Sure.
paused the order to end birthright citizenship, calling it blatantly unconstitutional. How do you reconcile this challenge to the 14th Amendment to the Constitution?
So I obviously disagree with that judge, and these things, some of them will be litigated. That's the nature of our constitutional system. But here's the basic
Parte del
idea
sistema.
of President Trump's view on this. If you are a lawful permanent resident or a legal immigrant who plans to stay, your children, of course, should become American citizens. But let's say you're the child of an ambassador. You don't become
But that's not part of it.
well, that
There's
is
already a carve-out
that is
having
an
to do
important
with kids of
principle.
diplomats.
But we're saying that that carve-out should apply to anybody who doesn't plan to stay here. If you come here on vacation and you have a baby in an American hospital, that baby doesn't become an American citizen. If you're an illegal alien and you come here temporarily, hopefully, Your child does not become an American citizen by virtue of just having been born on American soil. It's a very basic principle in American immigration law.
Entiendo su argumento, pero no estoy de todo de acuerdo más porque, hey, es parte de la Constitución. Tienen que lidiar con la Constitución antes de poder hacer cualquier cambio. Esa es mi opinión.
That if you want to become an American citizen and you've done it the right way, and the American people in their collective wisdom have welcomed you into our national community, then you become a citizen. But temporary residents, people who come in here, whether legally or illegally, and don't plan to stay, their children shouldn't become American citizens. I don't know any country that does that or why we would be different.
Well, this is a country founded by immigrants.
Well, this is a country founded by... This is a very unique country, and it was founded by some immigrants and some settlers, but just because we were founded by immigrants doesn't mean that 240 years later that we have to have the dumbest immigration policy in the world. No country.
Ay, controversial, pero tiene razón también, ¿no? O sea, es medio absurdo que leyes y normas de hace 240 años, 300 años atrás sean las normativas de hoy en día.
Says that temporary visitors, their children, will be given complete access to the benefits and blessings of American citizenship. America should actually look out for the interests of our citizens first, and that means, again, if you're here permanently and lawfully, your kid becomes an American citizen. If you're not here permanently, if you're not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States and don't plan to be, why would we make those people's children American citizens permanently?
I want to ask you about refugee admissions, which were just suspended by the president. That has nothing to do with the U.S. border. Refugee screening takes 18 to 24 months to go through. They are heavily vetted. Left literally at the airport this week were thousands of Afghans, some of whom had worked with the United States government and were promised to come here. When you talked to us in August, you said, I don't think we should abandon anybody who's been properly vetted and helped us. Do you stand by that?
Well, Margaret, I don't agree that all these immigrants or all these refugees have been properly vetted. In fact, we know that there are cases of people who allegedly were properly vetted and then were literally planning terrorist attacks on our country. That happened during the campaign, if you may remember. So clearly not all of these foreign nationals have been properly vetted.
But there are 30,000 people in the pipeline, Afghan refugees.
But my primary concern as the Vice President, Margaret, is to look after the American people. And now that we know that we have vetting problems with a lot of these refugee programs, we absolutely cannot unleash thousands of unvetted people into our country. It's not good.
These people are vetted.
Just like the guy who planned a terrorist attack in Oklahoma a few months ago, he was allegedly properly vetted, and many people in the media and the Democratic Party said that he was properly vetted. Clearly he wasn't. I don't want my children to share a neighborhood with people who are not properly vetted, and because I don't want it for my kids, I'm not going to force any other American citizens' kids to do that either.
No, and that was a very particular case. It wasn't clear if he was radicalized when he got here or while he was living here.
I don't really care, Margaret. I don't want that person in my country, and I think most Americans agree with me.
2 weeks ago, you were on Fox News, and you said, if you protested peacefully on January 6th and had Merrick Garland's Department of Justice treat you like a gang member, you should be pardoned. If you committed violence on that day, obviously you shouldn't be pardoned. Did you counsel the president against these blanket pardons for 1,500 people?
Well, Margaret, I noticed
including those who committed violence.
Margaret, I noticed that you cut off the thing that I said immediately after that. The full quote is that, of course, there are gray areas. And here's the nature of the gray area. Merrick Garland's Department of Justice denied constitutional protections in the prosecutions. There were double standards in how sentences were applied to the J6 protesters versus other groups. What the president said consistently on the campaign is that he was going to look at a case-by-case basis, and that's exactly what we did. We looked at 1,600 cases, and the thing that came out of it, Margaret, is that there was a massive denial of due process of liberty, and a lot of people were denied their constitutional rights. The president believes that. I believe that, and I think he made the right decision.
Daniel Rodriguez used an electroshock weapon against a policeman who was dragged out of the defensive line by plunging it into the officer's neck. He was imprisoned, sentenced to 12 years, 7 months. He got a pardon. Ronald Maccabee hit a cop while wearing reinforced brass knuckle gloves, and he held one down on the ground as other rioters assailed the officer for over 20 seconds, causing a concussion. If you stand with law enforcement, how can you call these people unjustly imprisoned?
Margaret, you're separating, there's an important issue here. There's what the people actually did on January the 6th, and we're not saying that everybody did everything perfectly. And then what did Merrick Garland's Department of Justice do in unjustly prosecuting well over 1,000 Americans in a way that was politically
Is
motivated?
violence like that against a police officer ever justified?
Violence against a police officer is not justified, but that doesn't mean that you should have Merrick Garland's weaponized Department of Justice expose you to
Creo que esta es la primera respuesta que ha dado en la entrevista que a mí no me convence para nada. Y ahora,
incredibly unfair process, to denial of constitutional rights, and frankly, to a double standard that was not applied to many people, including, of course, the Black Lives Matter rioters who killed over 24 people and never had the weight of a weaponized Department of Justice come against them. The pardon power is not just for people who are angels or people who are perfect. And of course, we love our law enforcement and want people to be peaceful with everybody, but especially with our good cops. That's a separate issue from what Merrick Garland's Department of Justice did. We rectified a wrong, and I stand by it.
I'm being told we're out of time, but I want to quickly
Sure.
ask you, the
Please.
richest men in the world were at that Capitol on Inauguration Day, heads of Amazon, Google, Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook. In August, you told us Google and Facebook are too big. We ought to take the Teddy Roosevelt approach, break them up. Don't let them control what people are allowed to say. They've now donated to the Trump inauguration. Are you still going to break up big tech?
So, you know who else was at the inauguration was my mom, and a lot of people who just supported the president and fought every single day to get his election. And
They
to make
gave
it,
$1
and to make
million
it, and to make it possible.
each to the inauguration.
And there were a lot of people who didn't give $1 million to the inauguration.
pretty
who
good
were on that-
seating.
who were on that stage, Margaret. They didn't have as good a seating as my mom and a lot of other people who were there to support us. But look, we believe fundamentally that big tech does have too much power, and there are two ways they can go about this. They can either respect Americans' constitutional rights, they can stop engaging in censorship, and if they don't, you can be absolutely sure that Donald Trump's leadership is not going to look too kindly on them.
So they're still on notice.
They're very
como pueden ver en el tiempo, ahí medio que termina el video. Y tengo que ser sincero. Cuando apareció JD Vance como vice, como dije al principio, no le tenía nada de fe, no sabía nada de él. No creía que tuviera el potencial o la calidad. Pero cada vez que veo entrevistas con él y cosas por el estilo, cada vez mi perspectiva cambia un poco. Cada vez me va agradando un poco más, cada vez lo veo un poco más inteligente, más competente. Para mí esto fue una entrevista casi perfecta por parte de él. Y eso que la periodista estuvo intentando derribarlo todo el tiempo. Habrá tenido que una o dos, tal vez, respuestas media blandas que no convencen, pero por lo general hizo un excelente trabajo en esta entrevista. Espectacular. Y hey, quién sabe si por ahí Trump no logra su plan del tercer mandato en el 2028. Tal vez este sea el próximo presidente de los Estados Unidos. ¿Quién sabe? No sería absurdo. Bueno, finalizamos por acá. Hasta la próxima. Chao, chao.